I got great dogs. Anyway, so how many people here have thought about or have written a memoir? Cruel. So we've got a lot of people here. Good. Well, these two are definitely experts in it. They are very successful with their memoirs. Patricia Conaway to my left here. Now I'm just going to read what their bio says because it's easiest for me. Grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and wanted a horse from the time she was 5. So did I, but I didn't get one. She graduated from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Indiana University of Pennsylvania. With a BA in psychology. She received a master's in international business from the American Graduate School of International Management, since renamed Thunderbird School of Global Management, in Glendale, Arizona. After 15 years in corporate America, advertising businesses from Manhattan to Sydney, Australia, she settled in Santa Fe, where she ran her own advertising consulting firm and at this point was lucky enough to have found a rekindled passion for horses, places to ride, and fellow riders. Presently, she lives in Cerrillos, New Mexico, where she teaches horsemanship on her ranch and wrote her award-winning memoir, Listening with My Eyes. When she's not riding horses, she enjoys painting or traveling often to exotic places for a horse-related adventure. The lady on my right, Ms. Judith Avila, is a graduate of Duke University who discovered writing after working as an air traffic controller and a computer expert, and a computer consultant. Yeah, you should read my memoir. It's all about that.
I want to.
In 2007, she met Navajo code talker Chester Nez and convinced him that his story needed to be heard. She recorded Chester's narrative for 3 years and then committed it to paper. The resulting work, Code Talker, was published by Penguin in 2011. It has sold upwards of 150,000 copies. It won the New Mexico Presswoman Zia Award and the New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards. National Public Radio selected Code Talker to read on air. Judith is a former SouthWest Writer Board member and is also in the process of completing 5 as yet unpublished novels. So these ladies, I'm going to just hand you guys the mic and take it away.
Okie dokie. Yeah.
Hi guys. Hi. Good to see all these smiling faces here tonight. I'm going to start because I put together 5 things that I think are crucial in memoir, and Patricia's going to chime in whenever she wants to and give her ideas too after I'm done, and then we're hoping you'll all have loads of questions because after all this is a panel discussion, and if there are no questions it's going to be a rather short panel discussion. So why don't I start? First, I have to confess I have not yet had the courage to write my own memoir. I've written someone else's memoir, and for him it took courage. For me, not so much. It's very different when it's not your own. So I admire everyone here who has written or is working on their own memoir. Just had to get that out of the way. Okay. Can't see him with my glasses. The 5 things that I feel are really crucial when you write a memoir, are crucial pretty much when you write anything. But let me talk a little about them. I'll give you the list and then I'll tell you what each one means. 1, I feel you have to find the core truth of your story. 2, I feel you have to keep in mind that this is an act of courage, but don't give in to any temptation to fabricate or make yourself better than you really are. 3, never tell the real reader how they should feel about something. Always, always explain to them all the different things that are going on in the story, but don't tell them what they should feel. 4, let us get to know your characters slowly. And 5, always keep the story in mind. So there's the list. Let me talk a little about each one. Patricia, chime in anytime, correct me. slap me, whatever.
What's the fifth one again?
Yes.
What's the fifth one again?
Oh, the fifth one, I can't remember the order I had them in. Oh, keep the story in mind. And I'll say more about each of these because a little label doesn't really tell you much. But when you're writing a memoir, it may be about your whole life, but generally it's only a segment. So we're going to start with one, finding the core truth. You really want to know what it is you want to communicate to anyone who reads your memoir before you get started. And that is something that isn't easy for most people. I know it would not be easy for me. And on Chester's book, I was lucky because Chester was a code talker. People wanted to read about him automatically. But I still had the challenge of finding the core truth in the book. And for me, it wasn't, hey, he's a code talker, he's a hero. That was only one element. The core truth for me was, look what this guy who was spat upon, looked down upon, prejudice against his entire life, ended up doing for his country. And look what all his fellow code talkers did too. And it was for me about the importance of other cultures in our culture and the importance of their bravery. But when you know what you want to communicate, like I figured out with Chester when I was first writing, then your book has a focus. And it needs a focus because the events you relate will fall into place then. And it'll be something as simple as like the importance of kindness maybe, or something as complex as the injustice of racial inequalities. But to have a coherent story, you have to have a focus. And the events in your story must support that focus, or I call it core truth. When you know that truth, it'll allow you to connect the events to the focus and to create a unifying thread through the book, and that runs through your whole story. Every scene in your story should pull the reader along with you towards the core truth of that story. If you don't do this, your story feels like a jumble of little events, and it feels like it's jumping from random scene to random scene. And I feel readers need a sense of continuity if you want to hold on to them. And a purpose. Having a focus gives purpose. Okay, number 2. Okay, please keep in mind, writing the memoir is an act of courage. It probably involves struggle, and it's also an act of ego. You want others to appreciate your story. Okay, but don't make the story something it isn't. Resist the urge to fabricate or to make yourself into a hero if you weren't one. Remember, your friends and your family are undoubtedly going to read this, and unless you want to take out a contract on all of them before you publish it, you better be honest. No one's perfect, and own up to that. And your readership will definitely appreciate that. Readers don't like heroines or heroes who are all perfect. So you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be interesting. Okay, number 3. Never tell the reader how they should feel. This is something that I've seen in many memoirs that I've read. I love memoirs, and I read a lot of them. I find, though, that so often people give in to saying, well, the teacher who picked on my little kid was really wrong and really did terrible things, and they enumerate all the terrible things, instead of showing us the teacher picking on the little kid and the little kid holding back tears and trying to say something and being interrupted and told he's a bad kid. And the reader can't help but judge for themselves that the teacher was wrong when you do it this way. So do avoid telling us someone was wrong or right. It works for any kind of life situation, but I think it's strongest when you're talking about something you feel adamantly about and you're angry about. Don't give us your anger. Give us the events that lead to that anger. And I did that quite a bit in the Code Talker book. It was very hard to keep from saying, oh my God, how could the government do this to these people? I kept backing up and saying, show the events, show the facts, don't show your own anger. The readers are smart, they'll figure it out. Okay, 4, let us get to know you and all the characters in your memoir slowly. Flesh them out slowly. For maximum impact, don't just introduce a character and give us a data dump on them and figure, you're done, we know that character. We don't, and we won't like it if we're reading your memoir. Let your characters struggle and show us the struggle. And of course you have a struggle you want to talk about, but the other characters in your memoir probably have struggles as well. No one starts out already having achieved their goals. So take the readers along with you in your struggle. The struggle and the work to achieve what you're trying to achieve are the real meat of the story. And then 5th, always keep the story itself in mind. Don't let yourself go down some alley somewhere that is a favorite topic of yours and rant. Keep the story in mind, because if you don't tell the story well, your readers they'll give up. Cut unnecessary scenes, even if they make you look good. Story is really, really powerful, and I believe that the hope of the world rests on our knowing each other's stories. So please do write your memoirs. It's important that we're able to walk in someone else's shoes and understand them. So writing a memoir is a very important act of courage. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
You know, when we were invited to do this, can you hear me okay? Yes. It's all right. Basically, Judy emailed me and said, you know, think about 5 things, 5 key points you want to say about doing a memoir. And by the way, we didn't collaborate. We just met up here tonight. And interestingly, my points are not very dissimilar from hers. But I had a different tack on mine, and I want to begin what I'm about to say by mentioning this lady, Lee, who is sitting right here in the yellow. And Lee came up to me before we sat here at this panel and said, how do you know what to include? I'm going to start here, and it's kind of jumping into the middle. How do you know what to include that will make other people want to read it and care about it and find it interesting? And you know, I think it's a great question. And what I wanted to say was this. I think that probably, at least concerning my own memoir, you know, I got really deep and personal, and there were so many discoveries. By the way, I should tell some of you who don't know, my memoir is about how my formerly abused horse, who I bought when she had been drugged for the entire time I interacted with her, and then I got her home and she was crazy, and people told me to put a bullet in her brain or get rid of her, and instead I sought professional help, and I learned how to understand her and learn how to get her respect by understanding her body language. I have a whole talk I give on this. and I was a keynote, for instance, 2 years ago at the New Mexico Conference on Aging. So this is about body language, my book is. And I found that my terrible problem horse, who I thought was going to kill me, actually turned out to be one of the best teachers I ever had in my life, because she forced me to learn how to understand her, and that helped with my mother, because my mother had Alzheimer's and she lost her ability to speak. And guess what? I found one day applying horsemanship techniques to my mother.
And they work.
And they worked. You know, it was to get her cooperation, by the way, because the way you get a horse's cooperation is if you can move a horse's feet at your command, you got control of that horse. Guess what? My mother got contracted and very difficult to move, in addition to not speaking at all. And my horse became one of the best mentors and gurus that I've ever met in my life. So that's the story behind the story. So what Judy said I couldn't agree more with, which is the authenticity. And what do I mean by authenticity? You know, readers are not stupid. And I think, I don't know if this is true, but I bet as we get older we read more because we have more leisure time. And so, you know, when you attract a reader to get to your book, to read your book and want to finish it, first of all, it's a huge honor. It's a huge honor for someone to say they want to read your book, number one. And number two, what's important to a reader? Well, guess what? I think what's important to other people is what all of a sudden sort of rose to the surface of what was important to you. What did you learn from your experience? And as Judy said as well, you know, it's a segment usually of your life that you're writing about. It's an important piece that you feel the need to share. And so if it's important to you, and it was like one of my horsemanship instructors used to call it a blinding flash of the obvious. You know, sometimes when you're like driving down the road or you're walking your dogs and you get this incredible insight into something, those are things that I think other people want to know and want to experience as well, vicariously through your experience. I also wrote down some other things that I wanted to share with you that Judy said that made me think more about what I wrote. And obviously things like vulnerability, sharing your vulnerability. And she's absolutely right. You know, people don't want to read, I don't think, a memoir about a hero necessarily, and it would be you. That would be me, the hero. But, you know, everybody can relate to feelings of inadequacy, feelings of incompetence, feelings of incredible fear. What if I mess this up? And who am I going to blame? You know, all of it's about being vulnerable and being able to share that vulnerability and being really honest about it. Because what do you get when you do share that vulnerability? You know what you get back? Incredible empathy, compassion, and sometimes those things that evoke those emotions in your reader are those very things that you should be writing about. And sometimes, oh, by the way, it's really hard. I wanted to come to that a bit. One of the things I wrote down that I think is necessary to write a memoir is what I call grit.
Yes.
Grit. And that's the ability to dig deep and to draw out of your own gut some of those real core emotions that you ran the gamut with whatever your experience was. And you know, most of us, I learned this from my horse, you know, the most basic fundamental emotion we humans experience, and by the way, it's true, I think, of every sentient being, is fear. Who can't relate to fear? Who can't relate to fear? I mean, I went through fear every day with this crazy horse, and then with my mother, who I was so fearful. And I share this about pretty much every decision I made. You know, was this the right thing for her? Was it going to be the right thing for her quality of life? And whose advice did I ask, or could I ask? And you know, sometimes I got to tell you, people who, I'm digressing a bit here, but you know, sometimes people who offer up their advice are the worst ones to take advice from. Am I right about this? And you know, one of the things that I share a lot in my book is trusting your own instincts and believing in your own gut and your own intuition. Some other things I wanted to mention before we open this up to some questions and comments is I think that every successful memoir is a memoir that appeals to our collective, for lack of a better word, humanity. It's about humanity. Whether you're reading a memoir, I read one not too long ago about the guys who, I forget his name, but there was a documentary about the guys who tried to break through the ice in the Arctic Circle. What was his name? And they had to eat their dogs and, what was it? That, yes. I mean, you know, you could almost feel the cold. Right? You could feel the wind in their faces as they were breaking through ice and trying to just survive. Here's the last thing I have to say, which I think is maybe the most important of all. It took me and this is my introductory to what I'm about to say, it took me 8 years to write my memoir, and the reason was that it was painful. There were times I had to just take a break and give myself a couple of months off, because writing about my mother's steady and inevitable and very noticeable decline was really painful. And knowing that I'm watching her die by millimeters, it was really painful. So what's the point of my telling you that? The point is, be tenacious with yourself. Be tenacious and give yourself room to take breaks if you need them, but never lose sight of your vision and your goal. Get that sucker done. Get it done and visualize it, you know, visualize in your mind's eye. What do you see your book looking like? What do you see it looking like on the bookshelves next to other books that are maybe other memoirs or in the subject matter that you choose to write about? Don't let go of your dream. Don't let go of your goal. And even if it takes you 8 years or more, you know, get it done. Just persevere and get it done. Thank you so much. And thanks. Sorry? Listening with my eyes. Yeah.
You can hold it up.
Oh, yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
You know, one of the fears that I have is I didn't break through ice. I haven't trained a horse that was badly abused. And I say to myself, who would want to read about some of the mundane things that have occurred in my life? There may have been struggles, but it doesn't seem like it rises to the occasion that other people would might want to share it.
Well, first of all, you're never going to know that if you don't sit down and write it, right? So you have to give yourself permission to sit down and start and begin. My book began as a journal, and the reason was the horsemanship instructor that I went to said to us all, I was the worst in the class, by the way. Me and my horse were the absolute bottom. And you know what he said? Keep a journal, because while you're making progress, you may not know you're making progress until you go back and read the journal. And you know, that's really true. So I would suggest to everybody to begin by keeping a journal. And you know what I do now? I have notes. I have little notebooks in my car, in my purse. And when I have a brain, you know, like a blinding flash of the obvious, or an insight, or a great phrase that I might have heard on the radio or something, I write it down right there. I write it on my knee in the car. So I think, you know, what is that great saying? The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Begin to write. And don't edit yourself. Don't believe that what you have to say about your experiences is invaluable to someone else. I bet you it is. I really believe that. I think that we have, you know, again, I'm going to sound a little corny here, but, you know, there is a brotherhood of man. You know, and we humans share many things. And we don't always understand. Your experiences might be the key that unlocks someone's understanding to something in their own life. So don't do that. Don't edit yourself before you've begun.
Do you have anything you want to add?
I was just gonna say something. It seems like when you're talking about your memoirs, and with mine as well, the key element, what you were talking about, the core truth or whatever, is something that every single person who, if they pick it up, should be able to identify with.
Yes.
Now,
Absolutely, yes.
in her case, of course, and it may be something that's very personal, like dealing with mother's Alzheimer's. And, you know, just about everybody has somebody they know that has these problems. Or in her case, with with Chester Nez, here is something that was nationally known about and affected everyone because of his war experiences and stuff. So everyone has a touchstone to begin with. So where in your story, in mine, Ronald Reagan fired 100,000 air traffic controllers.
I remember
Okay,
that.
almost everybody does. To this day, if I say I was an air traffic controller, guess what's the first thing they say to me?
Did you get fired?
No,
by
the
Reagan?
first, actually, the ones that they say to me is, oh, I hear that's a stressful job.
Yes.
90% of the people who hear that say that to me first, because the union had did a really great job of selling this as a stressful job. But, you know, so I have two things that went in. One, rebuilding the whole air traffic system that touches everybody. And two, being a woman in a traditionally male job. And in the 80s, when things like, you know, the harassment laws were on the books, but they were more of a concept than a reality. You know, so I guess what I'm trying to say is find in your memoir what it is that's going to reach out and be understandable to everyone else, and find that and make that a part of it that you dig into that with.
I just wanted to say too, you know what, when you go through your lives, your respective lives, and you have one of those aha moments, guess what? Maybe some of us can benefit from one of your aha moments. Go ahead.
What do you do if your core truth involves a person who might get hurt by what you've written?
Is
Even if
the
you
person someone you might talk to about this?
Talk to a lawyer.
Talk to a lawyer, he said. No, seriously,
it could be. It could
I
be.
think the first thing you should do, if it's someone you care about, if it's someone you don't care about, that puts a whole different face
Most of them
on
are dead,
things.
but one isn't.
Okay, one isn't, and you don't want to take out a contract, right? Okay. I think you need to talk to that person and let them know what you're thinking of writing, how they feel about it, and it may strengthen your truth that you need to show this person in the way you were thinking you needed to show them, but it may change some things in your head too, depending on how they feel and how you interpret what they say to you. But I think it's really important when you're afraid you're going to hurt someone to talk to them. And then if you come to the conclusion that in order to tell your story, it has to happen that way, tell them that, you know, I'm sorry, but I need to tell this story the way I see it. And if you feel badly about that, you can always, in your acknowledgments, thank them for talking with
Great
you
idea.
and discussing this issue, or I don't know for sure what it is you're talking about, but you can thank them and say, you know, everyone has their own view of this situation, and I want to thank so-and-so for being so understanding about my book. So.
Great idea.
You can also change their name.
You can, but they'll know themselves. I think most
They
people
would, but
would.
not everybody else would.
Did you have a question?
Well, a comment and a question. First and foremost, I wanted to say that I appreciate what you ladies have to say about authenticity and how everyone has a story to tell that can be, you know, projected, that other people can grasp onto. And I've heard this a lot too, where people, I was one of these people when I first started writing creative nonfiction, where people around me would be like, I don't have anything to say, and I thought that same thing. I'm like, well, me neither. But then I start writing. You know, I start writing and stuff comes out, and I'm like, oh, this is important. Like, how could I not have seen that thing? And I think that it's really important that memoirs, people who have written memoirs, tell whole groups of people about that, because everyone just has an amazing story. And second, I just had a question. So in regards to like changing people's names and writing memoirs and creative nonfiction in general, I found that in writing my own, there's always a bit of a fictionalization process that happens with some memoirs and creative nonfiction where, you might change some names, or like in a standard manuscript, maybe you might throw two characters together because maybe they're two friends who acted the same for you, and it's just easier to make them one person.
Simplify it.
Yeah, simplify things. And I guess I wanted to see how you two feel about that as people who have written memoirs, and what your take on that is.
I think if you do that, you need to, at some point, footnote the fact that you did it.
Exactly.
Because other people will know you've done that, and just for the sake of honesty. But don't put it in the middle of the book where you're writing the story. Write your story the way you want to. But footnote that your interpretation thought the story would be smoother or less confusing if you combined a couple of characters. And you don't even have to be specific about who they are. You might put it in your prologue, something along those lines. As far as my particular book, Code Talker, goes, I didn't feel that I had any ability to do something like that because it was not my story. So you're getting two sides of memoirs. It's very different writing someone else's story from writing your own when you're your own editor and whatever you want to say goes. I went over this book with Chester. We probably read it together, the whole book, at least 4 times to make sure I didn't misrepresent anything he felt. And I felt that my own feelings sometimes didn't jibe with his, but I didn't feel that I had any permission, really. I couldn't give myself permission to change anything he felt. And he was such a good person. I mean, he was the kind of person you get to know and you just fall in love with them. They're just wonderful, they're honest, they're humble. And so I really didn't need to change anything he felt, but most of what he felt that I didn't was he was honest and humble, and I would think I'd be bragging about what I'd done. So I had to resist the temptation to brag about him.
That's not the Navajo way.
It isn't, you're right.
I will tell you, with my memoir, I didn't do that at all. In fact, I was so honest. And if any of you read the book, or those of you who have,
I've read it, it's good.
I have an older brother who didn't really help much at all other than get my parents on the plane so I could kidnap them and bring them here. And I mean kidnap. I mean, they didn't know that they were leaving their home forever and being put in assisted care. So I had like 3 editors. One was a super professional one, but other, friends edited and so on. And my graphic designer said, you're kind of rough on your brother. But I was really honest. But I did change. By the way, I changed everybody's name, and I also described people very differently than what they looked like because they could sue me. The lady who ran one of the facilities where my mother lived didn't look at all like I described her in the book at all. So I changed a lot of names, and I changed physical appearances and so on because I really could have been sued. But when I said to my graphic designer, she said, your brother, you're kind of rough on him. And I said, am I too rough? You think I should soften it? And I said, because, I'm open to suggestions. And you know what? She said, not if it's the truth. And I said, well, it's the truth. So I left a lot of stuff in there that's kind of rough. But it was factual. It's really how it happened, yeah.
Isn't that where show don't tell comes in?
Yeah.
Because if you
thank you.
describe
Yes.
what your brother did without saying
Yes.
anything
Without
about
offering
it, then
an
you're off the
opinion.
hook, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I just basically, did summarize what he did or did not do. And yeah.
Is he talking to you?
Oh yeah, that's another story. Yeah, yes, Dan.
Question for, I guess, both of you.
And then I want to get to this guy.
Given that you, as you said, find the core truth of your story, what's the essential difference between memoir and biography or autobiography, so that I would know that I'm not straying off the path of memoir into one of those two?
Well, I'm just going to say, first of all, I think there's similarities in the construction of a book, whether it's a memoir or a biography or whatever. I guess the difference is probably, at least in just my opinion, I think the difference with a memoir is that it really is your feelings and your experience that no one else could have experienced the way you did. Whereas a biography can often be just a summary of what happened. Whereas a memoir is it can be in some ways a very deep and profound and personal rendition of your own very personal story.
Thank you. A biography, by definition, is someone's life pretty much from birth to death, generally.
Good point.
Yeah.
That's true.
And it is written by someone else, or it wouldn't be a biography, it would be an autobiography. And you, as Patricia said, you can't get as deep into someone's mind in a biography as you can in a memoir. Or in my case, I sometimes felt that it was tricky because I sure didn't want to misrepresent Chester, but I got to know him so well. I got to know his whole family. I go to all their parties. I'm having 100 of them to my house on Saturday. So you really have to feel you understand the person before you try to get into their head at all. An autobiography is different from a memoir in that it generally covers your whole life too, but you've written it, not someone else, like a biography. And a memoir generally covers one key area or several key related areas. Like in Patricia's book, she didn't start to giving us a lot of information on her childhood and stuff. She concentrated on the part of her life that she wanted you to know about, her mom and her horse, her difficult horse. I don't know how you kept getting on that horse. When I was reading it, I was like, oh, don't get back on. So autobiography, to summarize, is a whole life written by yourself. Memoir is generally a piece of a life that you feel is important, written by yourself. And biography is something written by someone else about a whole life that's generally researched and scholarly. I felt I could make Chester's book a memoir and not a biography because it was not scholarly. And I did a lot of research because I knew nothing about World War II. But it was his story, but I knew he wasn't going to write it, so I did.
Get on the side point of memoirs. So you're saying get into your character.
Into your what?
Character.
Oh, your character, yes.
Well, your character is you.
Yeah. When you're writing a memoir, but there will be other characters too.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not talking about memoirs. I'm talking about books and stuff.
Oh, okay.
And I know this is about memoirs, but when you write a book, you try to get into your character and tell the whole picture, right?
Yes, you do. You do try to show the whole picture of your characters, and you try to show why they are the person they are. You try to bring in the things that have formed them and made them the person that they are. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. In the back.
Yeah, I have two questions actually for Patricia. One, when did you have that aha moment that connected your mom's condition with the horse that you were working on? That's the first question. And then, fortunately or unfortunately, I've had several life events that have been significant, and my issue is trying to figure out which one or two I should focus on, and how do you do that? So, 2 questions: how did you make that connection, and also how do you decide what it is, what's the meatiest thing to write about?
Those are both great questions. Okay, question number 1. It was this aha moment where my mother was, they put her down for naps all the time, and it really used to make me mad because I'd go and visit her and they'd never get her up. It was easier to leave her, laying there, not bugging anybody and not having to be, entertained or whatever. So I was trying to get her out of bed. And she was laying there wide awake, her eyes, focused on the ceiling, and it was just broke my heart, because it was clear that she was bored to death, but they just left her there. So I had just come from being with my horse, which I used to do a lot, by the way, and just as a general thing, I'll tell you this. It is so difficult sometimes walking into one of these places with all of these people who are memory impaired and wandering around and nonverbal or whatever, that I used to ride my horse or do something with her before I'd go because it would put me in the right frame of mind. It was just too depressing sometimes otherwise. So anyway, I was trying to get my mother out of bed, and there's certain techniques you use with the horse, like 4 phases of pressure. In other words, if I want her to move, I might ask her politely, but the bottom line is she's moving, and that's the way you have to deal sometimes with Alzheimer's patients. It's not like you can be kind and gentle, but you also have to be firm. You are getting out of bed. So I just used horsemanship techniques. I rubbed her back and I said, come on, just sit up for me. And then I took baby steps. And I used 4 phases of pressure, and ultimately I got her to turn her legs, turn her body around and put her legs on the floor. And then I managed.
Putting the bridle on was kind of extreme.
You weren't supposed to tell that part. So anyway, and it worked. And what was funny though is that I didn't even realize I had done that until I was driving home. It was like 2 hours later, and I was driving home to go have dinner. And somewhere in the middle of the drive home, I went, and I realized I connected the dots that I used with my mother, techniques that I used all the time with my horse. And so it was just one of those things, it's like one of those things, when you're walking down the road and all of a sudden you get this blinding flash of the obvious about something that you've been ruminating on, and it's when you let your brain relax, often that, the solution to a problem will come to you. So the other thing is, how do you know what things to write about? What I would do, frankly, if I were you, I'd write about them all.
Can I always take it out?
Yeah, I'd write about everything. I would sit down, and if you need to compartmentalize and write about this incident and that event and this occurrence, then do that. And you might see a thread that goes through these things, or you might see something that pops up to the surface after you've written it.
Yeah.
That it didn't occur to you before, and all of a sudden, the cream does rise to the top. You'd be amazed. And here's the other thing too, I had, I think, a really great editor who, she eliminated pieces and she told me to cut this out and to put this in an appendix, and that was really, really helpful. So I do believe once you get your stories down, then, you need to have someone look at them with a fresh eye. And also help you through that, because it's a process.
I have a comment
Yes,
on the, and then we'll
Okay,
go.
go ahead.
On choosing what you want to write, many people who write memoirs write multiple memoirs. So if you don't end up feeling that the things you're writing about are connected, there's no reason that you can't write about each one and make it a different memoir. So that's a way to go too. Okay.
You know what, and I also wanted to say the same thing I said to this gentleman. Don't be too eager to edit yourself before you've begun. Just write. Sit down and do it.
Yeah, I was gonna almost say the same thing as hers. I found I was kind of overwhelmed, so I decided I'd divide some of my thinking into topics, like abuse or travel, relationship with my brother. So you could write them as short stories. And I figured I'm gonna write some as short stories and then later on, and maybe sell them as short stories and then combine them later.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great suggestion, yes.
And kind of what was said earlier and around before about whether you have something to say. I usually write fantasy, so I'm totally on the other side of the field. But sometimes for research, I'll read near-death experiences to get ideas. And I don't remember which story it was I read. In the near-death experience, this person was being guided around heaven and or whatever, and there was a library, and he was asking, what's down that aisle, what's down that aisle? And they came around a wing, and there's a wing in that library, and the person asked his guide, well, what's over there? He said, all the books that were never written.
Oh, I love that.
that sent a chill.
Yeah, it's like,
That sends a chill down my spine.
yeah.
You know, recently I had somebody ask me, I gifted her a book, and she said, why did you write it? Now, I realized afterwards she was just trying to psychoanalyze me. But, I said, well, number one, I wrote it to share, why do we write? Why does anybody write anything? Because you think you have something to share. You have something to say that you hope will be relevant to someone else.
And if you don't write it, it won't be written.
Exactly, and if you don't write it, you're very unique. That's right. Your very unique experience will never be shared. That's motivation right there, as far as I'm concerned, for every single one of you.
I love the idea that there's a library in heaven.
Hey, there you go. Yes, sir. Yes.
I've never been published, and I don't know that I will ever try to be published. So I'm asking from a kind of naive point of view, but some of the things that you said about blending characters and how this isn't quite true to a memoir, and I was thinking, well, at what point does a memoir become a short story, and how much of the decisions do you make are not just artistic, but in terms of marketing? Because you obviously have to be considering your market, and these are two different markets, and I'd never really thought about that before.
I was just thinking, that's hers. Okay, I have to admit, when I was writing this particular book, which is the only memoir I've written, I wasn't really thinking about the market until I'd finished writing the whole thing. And then I thought, you know what? He was a code talker. He fought in the war. They're not going to get to the war until halfway through the book, because I talked about a lot of things in his childhood that I thought made him strong. So I changed the order that I was showing things in and started with Chester and 12 other code talkers on the boat on the way to Guadalcanal, and described what he was seeing and feeling, and really it was the scariest day of his life. And so I wanted to show the things he was thinking about, and that the other code talkers' faces looked taut, and they tried to make jokes, but they couldn't seem to muster up a laugh. And so I started there, because I thought that for somebody who was interested in World War II, they'd be even more interested, because they'd think, wow, I'm going to get a real insight into these people. And for someone who wasn't interested in World War II, they would right away think, oh my gosh, this is a kid pulled out of high school, and here he is going to war, thinking he might be killed that morning. So I did think about market once it had been written, and I realized I had to if I wanted to sell it. Now, the other part, the short stories, I mean, it's a short story if it's short. It has to be long to be a book. So, short stories are great too. They're great practice for writing. And I love writers who are able to get me to care about their characters in the space of 5 or 10 pages. I think that's a wonderful talent, and that's a wonderful thing to do if you think you may never write a book. And you kind of implied that.
Okay. Here's my comment. First of all, You know, when I started writing, of course, I mentioned I started with a journal, right? So I didn't really think that I was ever going to be a book. As you think yours writing may never be a book. I think you should get rid of that thought right off the top. So number one, I didn't really think I was going to write a book, but you know, I had so many, I thought, enlightening and bizarre and wonderful and terrific experiences, both with my mother and communicating with her and my horse, that I would share these with a friend over lunch. And you know how people say, you know, you ought to write a book. And so I thought, well, why not? And so I started with the prologue, you know. Now that changed and morphed, and it isn't the same prologue. But you know what? Again, I think the important thing is to sit down and begin. You know, there's a wonderful thing by Goethe. There's a phrase that says, whatever you want to do in life, begin it. There's movement has magic within it. I mean, I'm really murdering that, but you know,
That's
it's
a nice idea.
But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the phrase, you know, moving forward has magic within it. You know, you have to take that first step and then you start to get the energy to create more. The other thing is, you know, self-publishing, that's what I did. And the only reason I self-published, I think I could have gotten it published. Of course, we'd all like to believe that. But I think I could have. But you know what? The reason I didn't, because I didn't want to wait anymore. I didn't want to go through another year or two of having somebody, you know, mess around with my book and then tell me what the cover should look like and blah, blah, blah. It was like, I know I've spent 8 years already, for God's sake. I'm going to get this out. And so self-publishing is always an option. And you know what, you'd be amazed at the amount of professionals out there. And just in this group alone, oh, by the way, editors, graphic designers, proofreaders, you got them all here. Go ahead.
I had to come up with a little quote because I have a favorite quote too, and it's kind of similar to Goethe's quote, but it's anonymous, and it is, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. And also
Henry Ford, by the way, morphed that, and what Henry Ford said is, "You think you're right, and if you think you're wrong, you're right again."
I like that. I like that one. Also, the persistence idea that Patricia was talking about. Believe me, you need to have persistence if you want to be published by a big publisher. I must have sent out 50 letters to agents about this book that I thought, wow, you know, this is a great story. Anyone's going to want to read this story. But it was not a slam dunk. The agents would write back things that were, I felt, quite condescending. Things like, oh, isn't it sweet of you to want to tell this man's story, but not for me. And, you know, it got to the point where I thought, gee, am I going to have to publish this myself? And then UNM Press became interested, but they wanted me to change the story to agree with what their non-Navajo experts told them. And I said there was no way. I had a head-to-head fight, and I'm not a very confrontational person, but with the editor at UNM Press, and I said, if you think I'm going to put 250,000 people into a box and label it Navajo, you can just go to hell. Well, guess what? They didn't publish Go Tucker. But it was the best thing that happened to me, because I looked at this and I thought, this is a fabulous story, a memoir by someone that has never been written by anyone, not anything even close. And so I thought I'd go after a big New York agent. And I wrote 5 letters, and within a couple hours I heard from one of the agents. And he said, I can sell this. I can get you a 6-figure advance for this. And I said, well, do it. And he did.
Yeah.
Just for both of you, how did you handle point of view, and also, since it's usually first person, how show telling more than showing.
Okay, that was for me? If that was,
In the sense that you're the autobio, and was it in first person?
yes, it is in first person. What I would do in order to be sure that I kept the kind of cadence and the kind of words Chester would use, I recorded his stories on and off for about 3 years. And I would listen to them before I'd write. I would listen to what he was saying. And I would just steep myself in it, and then I would write. And then I would take it to him and say, okay, here's what I've written about the boarding school. You know, let's go over it together. I want to know if there's anything I've said that isn't accurate. You're not going to hurt my feelings. So sometimes he'd tell me something that wasn't quite right, and other times at the end of the session, like he was a teacher, he'd say to me, good job, very good. He was so cute. Did I answer your question?
Half of it, but the other half was, if it is first person account, how do you tell, you get away from telling everything? And just show
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I see what you're saying, because you're there and you're telling it, is what you're saying. And you should be showing. Well, telling and showing aren't quite, to me anyway, the way you're interpreting them. The way I interpret it is, I can say, I'm telling the story now, I'm the first person, okay? This is me, about me. I can say, I walked into the room and I looked at every face in the room, and boy was I angry, and they looked angry too. Okay, that is telling. Or, also in first person, I can say, I flung the door open and I threw my books on the table, and I looked at each and every face and said, go to hell. That's showing. So really it doesn't matter if it's first person. Yes, you're telling it, but you can show the emotion rather than analyzing it and saying to the reader, I was angry. You show the reader you were angry. Is that answers it? Okay, good.
Okay, we got time for one more.
So if you know someone with a great story and you want to approach them, do you have any advice or contracts, any kind of thing that you need to discuss with someone that you...
With Chester, he was so humble, and he kept saying to me, I didn't do anything except my duty. I didn't do anything everyone else didn't do. And I had to convince him that it was important for people to know what his Navajo people did to help their country. And that if he didn't tell the story, no one would. Because there are some history books that mention the Code Talkers. And now there are a couple Code Talkers who have published with a university press and told the story, but none of the original Code Talkers who designed the code, proved it was going to work in battle, and then trained the Code Talkers following them had ever told the story. Chester's the only one. So I had to convince him that he would be preserving something that would help his people and would help everyone else understand what it was they had done. Now, that won't, of course, be the same thing that you would say to your, or maybe it is. I'm not sure what it is the person you know has done that you think needs to be written about.
But do you have to enter into a contract with them, or do you have to make a
I didn't. I did not have a contract with him at all until we signed a contract with Trident Media and with Penguin.
Okay.
But I didn't have a contract with him. I trusted him and he trusted me. If it's someone you aren't sure you trust, then I would suggest that you have a contract that says that you are writing this story as you interpret it as told by the other person to you, and have them sign it. But if you don't want to do something like that, or they're reluctant about that, just go over the book with them, like I did with Chester, you know.
Eventually did it with the publisher, so I mean, that's.
Oh, that had a contract.
Wash, yeah.
Yes, and we split everything down the middle, and, you know, it did provide a contract, having a publisher, yes. Yeah. I guess we're done, huh?
Thank you so much.